Welcome to 2819. I'm Sandra Dimas.
And I'm Daniel Almaguer.
And today's topic is a very lighthearted one.
Yes.
Just kidding. It's death before the fall.
In Everyday Apologetics, author and pastor Gavin Ortlund talks about Augustine's view on death before the fall.
And in Science Faith Connection, Jeff Swearink will chat with biochemist Fazale Rana on the difference between animal death and human death.
First up is Culture Talk. Sandra will be interviewing Kyle Keltz on the common question, could a good God allow death before the fall? So let's check it out.
Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we talk about culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. And I'm joined today with Dr. Kyle Keltz. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Yeah, you are a professor of English and also philosophy. I like those two things. And we're going to be talking today about a question that people ask regarding death before the fall. And they say, could a good God allow death before the fall? Before we start unpacking, let's first talk about what do we mean by death before the fall?
Okay, yeah, and that's great because there are a few things that you could confuse when talking about this with people who aren't familiar with it. When we say death before the fall, I think probably the most important word is what do we mean by the fall? And what we're talking about is basically Genesis 1 through 3. When we talk about the fall, we're talking about Adam and Eve sinning in the Garden of Eden. Genesis 1 and 2 talk about God creating human beings and He puts them in a garden. There's some interesting things. His special presence is there with them. But it talks about them being innocent and basically enjoying God's presence and being in the garden. When you get to Genesis 3, it talks about how Adam and Eve sinned and disobeyed God. And when that happens, not only are they kind of stained with sin, but they're also kicked out of the garden and they're separated from God. And that's what we mean when we say the fall. Now, when we talk about death before the fall, that might sound like maybe we're talking about human death, but we're actually asking about whether animals died before the fall. Because it's there's things in Genesis that indicate that Adam and Eve were probably either naturally or supernaturally immortal before they sinned. But what we're asking is, did animals die before that?
And so when we talk about death before the fall and animal death before Adam and Eve sinned, from a young earth perspective, where the earth and all of creation is about 6,000 to 10,000 years old, that might not be an issue. But from an old earth perspective, we do have to do the work of answering that question of how could there be long but finite periods of time and no death. So what does that look like? So what is the issue with regard to animals dying before Adam and Eve sinned?
Yes, and you got right at it because what happens is people when you read Genesis 1, it talks about God creating certain things. He creates the land and the sky, and then He fills it with creatures. And after He creates, it says that He pronounced this is good. He sees that it is good. Well, people think that because He is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, whenever He creates something and it says that it is good, then there's not going to be any deficiencies in it. Now, from an old earth perspective, when we look at the natural history of the earth, what we find is that it looks like animals have been dying, they've had diseases, and they've been suffering for millions of years before humans ever showed up. So there's this issue with, well, how do we reconcile that? When God created animals and He said, this is good, was He talking about animals that were susceptible to disease and dying?
Right, and then if there was no animal death before the fall, but then there is afterwards, then was there this giant shift in how predators, how they functioned and what they ate even? So how do we go about answering such a question of whether a good God would allow death before the fall? And how do we answer that?
Well, there's several ways you can approach it, philosophical, biblical, and theological ways. One thing I like to emphasize that I think it's not much, but it's a little helpful from more of a philosophical standpoint, is to just kind of step back and realize that from a Christian standpoint, what we believe is that only God is infinitely perfect, right? Now, when you think about what the kind of world he's going to make, and it's going to be it's going to be a physical world. When you think about it, since only God is infinitely perfect, any world he's going to make is going to actually fall infinitely short of his perfection. So even if he made a world that initially didn't have animal death in it, this still isn't infinitely perfect. But anyways, I just like to throw that out there. But when we start talking about more theological concerns, some people think, I think, especially like young earth creationists and other Christians, they think that when you look at Romans 5, the Apostle Paul says that death entered creation because of Adam and Eve's sin. Now, if you look at that passage closely, though, you'll see that the Apostle Paul is more like saying that death spread to all humans, to all people. So I don't think that you can use that to conclude that animal death was a result of the fall. And to me, it seems more likely that animals probably were dying before that. And I think the key to that is to notice in Genesis 1 where it says that God created human beings in his image. Now, a part of being an image bearer is that you are supposed to represent God. You know, that's why it's so bad for us to sin. And that's why Jesus tells us to be perfect like our Heavenly Father is perfect. That's a part of what we're supposed to be is being made in the image of God. Human beings are supposed to represent God. Now, a thing about that, though, is that one of God's attributes is wisdom, okay? So if God is going to create his image bearers, and a part of that needs to be wisdom, an obstacle is that you can't infuse wisdom into people. You know, wisdom is something that's earned. It's not created. So what I think is whenever God tells human beings to be fruitful and multiply, what he was wanting them to do was to spread out over the earth in his image, you know, always obeying him, but also learning from him and becoming wise in the process. An interesting thing is that when you study some of the ancient church fathers, there's a church father, 2nd century church father, Irenaeus. He writes about something similar to this. He says that the Garden of Eden, this is in his work Proof of Apostolic Preaching, and he also talks about the Garden of Eden in Against Heresies. But he talks about how the Garden of Eden was a local paradise, better than this world, and God put human beings in it so they could rule over the earth and so they could learn justice from God. And then when they sin, he kicks them out of the garden into this world. So it's really interesting. It seems like Genesis 1 through 3 is telling us that Adam and Eve were supposed to learn wisdom from God. Now, another thing is biblical theologians think that when you read Leviticus, it teaches that the closer you get to God, the closer you're getting to order and life and holiness. The further away you get from God, the closer you get to chaos and death. Now, I think it's highly likely that when God told them that if they touched or ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that they would surely die, they understood what he was saying because they would look out outside the garden and they could see that if they're going to eat from the tree, they're going to get kicked out, and they're going to be in that world of disorder. So, long story short, is that we think if they would have obeyed God, possibly by now, if Adam and Eve and none of their descendants sinned, now the earth would look like Revelation 21, where God's presence would be everywhere.
Right.
So, you know, whenever God creates animals and says this is good, he doesn't mean that they're perfect and they don't die. He means that they're doing exactly what he meant for them to do. And when you look at science, you see that the world is set up so that we've got ecosystems. Animal death and predation is just a natural part of that, and it's all for our good so that we can be healthy and be alive and be humans.
Well, and I think you make a good point, because sometimes people think that by God saying very good, that this current world is perfect, but obviously God was not surprised by what unfolded, and so this was very good for the plan that was already in action. Thank you so much for that. If you'd like to hear more about this topic, go to reasons.org and search Death Before the Fall.
What can we do if we think that there is a conflict between science and the Christian faith? I'm joined today by Dr. Gavin Ortlund, who has some ideas for us to consider. Dr. Ortlund is a Christian scholar and a pastor. Gavin, in previous episodes, we've been talking about the fact that church history can be a useful guide, can be a useful teacher as we try to wrestle through contemporary science-faith issues. And one of the things that you have said that church history can do for us is to help us expand our doctrine of creation. Could you unpack that a little bit for me?
Yeah, well, there's two examples of that have been helpful for me personally, and they both come from St. Augustine, who's someone I've spent some time reading and I've really learned a lot from. And one of them has to do with animal death, because this is one of the great challenges that comes up, is animal death before the fall of human beings. What do we do with that? And I actually don't think that being a young earth creationist totally takes that off the table, because a lot of young earth creationists admit, well, some animals have to die just to get to day 6. But I do think it's an issue that needs to be addressed. And I guess I, for some reason, had the idea that all throughout church history, everybody saw there can't be animal death before the fall. And that's kind of the default view. And the modern kind of old earth creationist views are kind of deviations from the norm. And St. Augustine was an example that that's really not the case. He talks a lot about animal death. He talks a lot about insects. He talks about the beauty of animals. And he says we should be careful not to sit in judgment on the way God has made the world. And he uses the metaphor of a lay person walking into a mechanic's shop. So obviously in his day, he's not thinking of cars, but machines of some kind. And he's saying how arrogant and foolish it would be for this lay person who doesn't know anything about the machines to start making judgments about, well, this one is good and that one is bad, and why do you have this one here? And he says that's kind of like when we sit in judgment on God's creation just because we don't understand how it works. We're like a lay person. We don't know everything. We should be more humble and careful before saying, well, that's evil. And he says that specifically in the context of dealing with animal death. And I think one of the passages on his mind there is Psalm 104, which depicts God's work of creation and then his providential oversight of creation in ways that don't seem to have this idea that all animal death and all animal suffering is bad necessarily. And I will grant that this is a tough issue. It has an emotional power to it, but I just think at the very least, someone like Augustine can help us recognize it's not quite so obvious as some people say. And even before the issues of modern science, you have people approaching this in a different way. The other area would be, I somehow thought when I was growing up that it's always better for God to create instantaneously than gradually and supernaturally rather than through natural processes. And I don't know why I thought that, but I did. And Augustine helped me with that because he has this idea of the seminal reasons or causes, and he talks about God sort of implanting seeds in creation that can unfold. And that idea can be misused by evolutionary theorists. He's not talking about evolution per se, but he is saying that God can create through intermediate causes, and that when that happens, it's no less a display of God's wisdom and power. So if a tree, if I'm on a hike with my son and I say, Isaiah, isn't that tree beautiful? God made that tree. If the tree came about through a seed and water and sunlight and time, that's not at all at odds with my statement that God made it. And I remember learning about the moon. Where did the moon come from? And the scientists say they just actually discovered this recently, or they've theorized it recently, that it was a meteor hitting the earth and scattering debris, and then it slowly coalesces. And let's say hypothetically that that's in fact true. Does that give less glory to God as the creator of the moon than if God had just said, poof, there it is? Well, I don't think necessarily that's the case. Either way, it's God who's doing it. And I believe God creates through both natural and supernatural means, but I think they're both a reflection of his wisdom and power. And St. Augustine was someone who helped me think about that.
Hello, Jeff Zorink here, and welcome to Science Faith Connection, segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas and see how they relate to the truth of Christianity. Today I'm joined by Dr. Rana, and we are going to be discussing the difference between animal death and human death. Fuzz, good to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Jeff.
So, obviously, everybody dies. Humans dies, animal dies. But why are we talking about animal death and human death? What's the significance of this topic?
Well, recently primatologists have studied chimps and their response to death, and have discovered that they respond to death in a way that indicates they understand that members of their community have died, and they actually have a death response that seems to indicate that they actually are mourning the loss of those individuals. So, for example, mothers who have infants that die will continue to carry those infants around with them after they've died. They'll carry the corpse around, and they'll swat away flies, they'll groom the corpse, and it can be several days, even several weeks, that they'll carry around this corpse before they actually let it go.
So this kind of has a connotation where we mourn our dead. If animals are mourning their dead, the distinction between humans and animals may not be as great as what we think.
That's right. Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. And for adults, there's even a much more pervasive response to the death of adults among chimpanzees, where they will, in some instances, strike the body apparently out of frustration or trying to revive the body. They'll stand a vigil over the body. They'll sniff it. There's it seems like a mourning process that's underway. Sometimes they'll groom it. They'll keep flies away, and then when the body's disposed, a lot of times they'll revere that site. That becomes almost like this special site that they either will return to it and visit, or sometimes they'll avoid the site as well. So there seems to be, again, this very real emotional response to death in chimpanzees that many people see as kind of like the antecedent to our death responses as human beings.
So as I'm listening to your language there's, they revere, they fear, they're mourning. Those are very human terms, and so it's kind of loaded. I'm kind of curious, what is the actual behavior that they're seeing? Is there a way to separate the behavior from the motivation, if you will? Because your mourning is one thing, but if you're picking flies off, that could be that's an activity as opposed to a thought, if you will.
Yeah, well, and I mean, a lot of people who work as animal behavioralists will point out that we really can't know what's going on in an animal's mind. There's no way you can really truly know that. We try to draw an inference based on the behaviors that we see. And it does appear as if there is some kind of genuine mourning that's taking place, or a recognition that there has been a significant loss, right? But, as I think as you're hinting at, there's a tendency that we have as human beings to anthropomorphize. We attribute human qualities to machines and to animals. And the concern is, could people studying the behavior, in this case of chimpanzees and their response to death, really being imputing human qualities to the chimps that really don't exist?
So I presume in this, where there was the site where the chimp died, that where they revisited or where they avoided, that there was some sort of statistical significance to how often they came there.
Right.
And then the question is, what is the significance of that activity or the grooming that would go on? By what sort of measure would they say, okay, we're aware that the chimpanzees are aware that something has happened, that this other chimpanzee is dead?
Yeah, well, it's really the sum total of the responses. So, for example, the group tends to be much more, somber, and their activity is diminished. So it's almost as if they recognize again that there's a very real loss that's taking place. But there are some animal behavioralists who say, that this response that they have to death actually serves a critical function within the chimpanzees that may really be a better explanation than the chimps are actually mourning the loss of the individual. So, for example, the mother that continues to carry the corpse around, well, that you could argue is essentially a behavior that would reflect a very strong nurturing relationship that the mother would have with the infant, and that chimps who refuse to give up the corpse of the child would otherwise be very good mothers who would be so attentive that it actually would improve the reproductive success. Whereas mothers that would tend to give up the chimp corpse very quickly, or the infant corpse very quickly, may not be sufficiently good mothers. And so kind of a byproduct of this is that they end up carrying around a dead corpse that we interpret as being mourning, or but it may be something else. Or when
so it sounds like there's some very real behavior that is going on that looks a lot like the way or at least it connects to the way humans do things. And then there's the question is, what's the explanation for that behavior? Is it kind of just propagating the species the best way, or is it actually the connection with humans?
Well, you know, and for example, with an adult, when an adult dies, depending on the stature of that adult within the group, that death is going to force a restructuring of the hierarchy of the group and the relationships in the group. And could this death response be a way in which the chimps are kind of coming to grips with the fact that there's going to be a restructuring that takes place? Is this
so there really is a societal type aspect, or a social aspect that's going on that whether, I mean, that's there and they're figuring out how to do, or they've got to deal with that at some level. And this is, of course, still very different than how modern humans respond to death through funerary practices, where these are highly ritualistic practices that are designed to honor and celebrate the person who's died, designed to comfort those people that have loss. And there's also a sense that this is part of the process of ushering that individual into an afterlife if there's if people are religious. And so, that's a very different response than I think what you're seeing with chimps when you look at functionally what it's accomplishing within chimps versus in humans. So how does this, when we look at this behavior as Christians work at RTB, how do you think about this sort of behavior? Does it support our position on creation evolution, or is it more naturalistic, if you will?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, there is a tendency that people have to view this as being an evolutionary antecedent to our death response as modern humans. But another way to look at it is that these animals are soulish animals, as Hugh Ross describes in his book, Hidden Treasures in the book of Job, that they're soulish animals. They're the nephesh animals that have soul-like properties, which means they're intelligent, they have an emotional capability. So they very well could be responding to this death as loss, but it also, again, has certain functionality within the species. So I would see this as being, again, part of God's design that reflects the nature of these creatures and also has a very important function in the social structure and the reproductive fitness of the group. Whereas, again, I see a very sharp distinction between the funerary practices in modern humans and chimps, where we really are showing evidence for symbolic behavior in the way we practice our response to death.
Well, thanks, Faz. I appreciate your comments. When we look at life here on Earth, one thing that's indisputable is that all life dies. Humans die and animals die. And the question is, do the way we respond to death show that animals are like humans, or are humans and animals exceptional? And what I love about what Fuzz has brought to us today is that he shows that the way animals behave actually reflect the way Scripture describes these remarkable animals, and it shows that that's very different than the way humans do things. I would encourage you to go to reasons.org and check out Fuzz's two-part article on this. Chimpanzees respond to death like humans. It gives you some great resources to help you use this remarkable discovery about how humans and animals deal with death and show that Christianity really is true.
We hope this episode has helped equip you to share your faith with compassion and confidence.
It's such a big topic, death before the fall. There are so many different paths that one can take and just kind of addressing some of the concerns and some of the issues. I really like what Fuzz had to say about just anthropomorphizing animals and kind of just being careful to not do that and put too much into the behavior that they're exhibiting.
Right, and I really appreciate how you and Kyle Keltz really helped show like what death before the fall actually is. Made it more clear for me.
Yeah. And don't forget, subscribe to the show and search for us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are at 2819 Show.
And if you want the audio version of the show, you can find us on most major podcast services. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast.
See you next week.
See ya!